I am in Santa Fe, New Mexico at the New Mexico Museum of Art on the Plaza. I have come to see their temporary exhibit called An American in Paris, The Art of Donald Beauregard. Chances are you have never heard of him. Beauregard was a young Southwesterner who studied in the arts capital of the world during his time, Paris, France, where he encountered all sorts of new developments in art, which was reflected in his own artwork before his untimely death at the age of 29. Considering that I just got back to the American Southwest after studying in Paris, I am interested to learn what his experience was like over 100 years before mine. Donald Beauregard was born in 1884 in the small town of Fillmore, Utah, and he was a member of the LDS Church. He began studying at the University of Utah, but in 1906 he left for Paris, where he studied at the Académie Julian until 1909, when he returned to Utah for financial reasons. After that, he worked as an artist for archaeological teams throughout the Southwest, including a summer with the prominent archaeologist and founder of this museum, Edgar Lee Hewett, at Frijoles Canyon in New Mexico. In 1909, he was part of the Cummings-Douglas expedition to the Rainbow Bridge in Utah, after which he painted this portrait of himself as a cowboy, with hints of influence from the French Impressionists. That is a Utah landscape that he painted in 1910, in which he used the spare light of the twilight scene to use blue in the shadows, which was often done by Impressionists like Monet. He painted this just before leaving for his second and final stint in Europe from 1912 to 1913, after which he returned to Santa Fe to seek treatment for his health issues. This is a great scene from 1910, The Evening in the Pueblo. He was fascinated by Puebloan culture and archaeology, influenced by his time in Frijoles Canyon with Hewett's summer archaeology class. It is definitely a romantic depiction of the ancestral Puebloan peoples. This is Gustav Bauman's study of Frijoles Canyon. He was another important southwestern artist who also accompanied Hewett on a trip to Frijoles Canyon. That is now Bandelier National Monument, and I have a video on that if you're interested. This is a chalk drawing by Beauregard. At the Académie Julian, he had to understand classical tradition and anatomy, even though he took to more modernist forms. This is Beauregard's depiction of the Rue Royale in Paris. It's a short street in between the Place de la Concorde and the Place de la Madeleine. He probably stopped to paint this impressionistic scene on location. Beauregard completed this drawing of a woman during that first European sojourn. It is similar to the portraits of his older contemporary Mary Cassatt, by capturing the details of the sitter while leaving the other elements more impressionistic. This one is fantastic. It is titled In a French Café, a depiction of a Parisian with a cigar in hand at a cafe. While he had been drawn to Impressionism during his years at the Académie Julian, on his second trip to Paris in 1912, he began experimenting with more modernist and expressive methods. This is his 1912 take on the Jardin de Luxembourg in Paris, to this day perhaps the most beautiful garden in the city. Beauregard used it to experiment with color as a means of defining space and as an expression of emotion. Here's another more leisurely scene, which was his usual subject matter on that 1912 Paris visit. Again, he used the outdoor park scene to experiment with human forms, and the surrounding landscape with bright and intense colors. In June of 1912, Beauregard traveled to Douarnenez in Brittany, a fishing village not too far from Pont-Aven, where he hoped to truly develop his own individual style. So these are the harbor houses in Douarnenez. Beauregard was particularly inspired by Vincent Van Gogh, and this piece, The Lone Trees, was intended as an homage to the late artist, with its bright and abbreviated application of paint in this countryside scene. By the end of 1912, Beauregard was ailing with what turned out to be stomach cancer, but to avoid tuberculosis, doctors suggested that he head for the alpine climate of Switzerland, so he went to stay in Lausanne, where he turned to the still life and the mountainous landscape. In this small canvas, he experimented freely with the abstract forms of clouds. This is the corner of the studio, which he finished in 1913 at Lausanne. He abstracted the subjects in favor of the colors, forms, and patterns. This clearly displays influence of Paul Gauguin. He was also heavily drawn to the work of Paul Cezanne. So in this still life he used a simple palette to produce simple forms, following the lessons of Cezanne. Next to that, they actually have a lithograph of a bather scene by Paul Cezanne. While there were hardly any Cezanne works in America in the early 20th century, American modernists still came to appreciate his essential forms and reduction of color. Here is another scene of Douarnenez from 1912. The local landscape as well as the culture of bread and women fascinated Beauregard, just as it had inspired Paul Gauguin and Paul Cezanne in Pont-Aven. This is a peasant market scene in Douarnenez. Again, he used the unique bread and subject matter to experiment with broken brushwork, subtly abstract forms, and expressive colors. This is a portrait of a peasant girl from 1912. It's a more naturalistic impressionist scene of a girl wearing a traditional Breton dress and coiffée. That is juxtaposed with this somewhat pointillistic portrait of a Breton peasant woman done in the spirit of Signac and Seurat. In July of 1913, Beauregard left Switzerland for Munich, Germany, where he painted this portrait of Samson as part of a series of works that explored the pitfalls of the world and the importance of virtue. By studying German artists in Munich, he continued to work, quote, as primitively as possible, and began exploring narrative subjects. For another example, here is Cincinnatus. This is Lazarus, not the man resurrected by Jesus, but a beggar from the book of Luke, who got shunned by a rich man. So when Lazarus died, he went to heaven, while the rich man was eternally tormented. Here is a centaur carrying off Dryad. I really like the scene of Pan playing his flute for a satyr, and the colorful landscape surrounding them. This is the portrait of an artist from 1912, intended as a self-portrait. Once Beauregard came back to Santa Fe to seek treatment for his chronic health issues, Edgar Lee Hewett commissioned him to create a series of murals for the New Mexico building of the Panama, California Exposition of 1915 in San Diego. So despite his illness, he went right to work on these scenes telling the story of St. Francis of Assisi and the Franciscan Order. So here's a watercolor sketch for the apotheosis of St. Francis scene. In this concept, Franciscan friars are building missions at Pueblo communities throughout New Mexico, where they would conscript the locals to build large adobe churches. These Franciscans are preaching to the Mayas and Aztecs. Beauregard approached these early encounters as a religious drama. This is a sketch for the Christopher Columbus mural. Here Columbus envisions a fleet of ships heading for the New World. This is a watercolor sketch of the Renunciation of Santa Clara, in which he emulated the styles of Fra Angelico and Sandro Botticelli, whose works he would have seen at the Louvre and during his travels in Italy. This was his proposal for a mural design at the Utah building of the Panama, California Exposition. There were going to be two depicting the history of Utah. This one is the Indian attack, which would have been next to the Mormon pioneers. That was his proposed seal design for the reception room of the Utah building. This woman is a personification of Utah wearing a Roman toga and holding a sego lily. He intended that image to be reproduced in mosaics and a relief sculpture in the reception room. Unfortunately, Beauregard's vision for the Utah building was not realized. Sadly, Donald Beauregard passed away on May 2nd, 1914, after a bout of stomach cancer. He was only 29 years old. By that point, he had completed 2 of the murals, but clearly he had plans for several others. The 2 murals that he did finish are on permanent display here at the New Mexico Museum of Art in the St. Francis Auditorium. Different artists completed some of the other scenes. Unfortunately, there was a concert recital going on during my visit, so I could not take a look at them. This is footage of the murals from my previous visit. They're pretty cool. It really is a tragedy that Beauregard lived for such a short time. He was quite talented and could have been one of the most important American modernists if he had lived longer. While this museum has a great and important permanent collection of New Mexican artwork, they do not have a permanent display as the facility is not all that big. However, I am happy to see that there is currently a selection from the permanent collection on display, which really should be a mainstay. This is Awakening, a 1943 piece by Agnes Pelton, the Desert Transcendentalist. That is a scene of Taos Pueblo at moonlight from 1914 by E. Irving Kaus, who, like Beauregard, received his formal artistic training at the Académie Julian in Paris, and in 1915 became a founding member of the Taos Society of Artists. The Springtime Rainbow from 1923 is fantastic. It is a combination of various early European modernist trends, such as Cubism and Expressivism, by Joseph G. Bacos. Joseph Henry Sharp was one of the most important artists in New Mexico. He was academically trained and first came to Taos in 1893. This is the Stoic from 1914. The Washington Landscape with Peace Medal Indian is an interesting pop art piece from 1976, reflecting the conflicts between the US government and native peoples during that time. Henriette Wyeth, N.C. Wyeth's daughter, married an artist from Roswell, New Mexico, Peter Hurd. Peter Hurd painted this portrait of a 15-year-old Billy the Kid rodeo winner in 1952. Here is a work of Georgia O'Keeffe, who began to visit New Mexico in the 1930s and ended up living at the Ghost Ranch, where she famously painted the magnificent scenery there, like the Chama River here from 1937. This is a New Mexico landscape from 1938 by Katie Wells, a somber and foreboding depiction of the Land of Enchantment. Here is El Santo by Marsden Hartley from 1919. I always like his quote that I am an American discovering America, as he sought out distinctively American subject matters. And here's The Antelope Dance from 1919 by B.J.O. Nordfeldt, who is clearly a fan of Paul Cezanne, whom he had studied in Paris. There's also a contemporary glass display. Unfortunately, I was low on time, so I had to rush through everything after Donald Beauregard. But here's some Chihuly glass, a turquoise Persian set. This art museum was the brainchild of Dr. Edgar Lee Hewett, the archaeologist who came to greatly appreciate the talents of Beauregard. He lived in this house right behind the art museum. Hewett played a crucial role in getting the Antiquities Act passed in 1906 and started the Museum of New Mexico, which includes the adjacent History Museum. Edgar Lee Hewett's ashes are interred inside the wall behind this plaque in the courtyard of the art museum. He passed away on December 31st, 1946. I have a great deal of respect for Hewett. He is joined in the adobe wall by his longtime friend and supporter Alice Cunningham Fletcher, who was an anthropologist that studied and documented Native American culture in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. She also helped to pass the Dawes Act. There are also several murals on the walls surrounding the courtyard. These were created as part of the FURA project of the New Deal, and directly inspired by the documentation of Alice Fletcher. So I really enjoyed that exhibit. It was interesting to see how the artist combined his southwestern background with the new artistic developments in France at that time, even though it was short-lived. I would definitely recommend seeing this exhibit about the nearly forgotten artist. It will be on display at the New Mexico Museum of Art until October 22nd, 2023. If you enjoyed the tour, then please check out my other videos on art exhibitions, museums, historic locations, and much more here in New Mexico, across the American Southwest, and even over in Europe. Additionally, I have a significant series on the history and attractions of Paris, France in the works. Also, please like this video, share it, and subscribe to my channel for more. Thanks for watching!